When I was 4 years old, I had my first ever real experience of understanding that as a black child with a physical disability, a black girl, I didn't have the same rights to bodily autonomy that everyone else did. I remember getting on the bus with my mom, heading to what was called the Human Macmillan Hospital in Toronto, walking into this giant space with white walls, and I would see a mat on the floor with toys surrounding me. I was super excited because I thought I was going to be heading there to play. A physiotherapist and a doctor approached me, and we engaged in a little bit of conversation, and they engaged with my mom mostly. And I remember them taking my leg and pulling it forward, kind of like an elastic band that refuses to stretch. That is what cerebral palsy feels like. And I started to cry. And my mom, being a newcomer, not understanding really what was going on, also started to cry and tried to halt the process, saying, "What is going on? Why is she in pain?" The doctor had a strange smile on her face. And she said, "Don't worry, this is going to help in the long run. This is going to make her feel better and be better." And she proceeded to take my mom out of the room into another room, which I learned later had a two-way window, because my mom refused to leave and go get a coffee like was suggested, and she watched me engage in the rest of this physiotherapy session without really wanting to. Looking back, I can understand now why I hated physiotherapy my whole life so much, because most of the time when I engaged with it, up until I was around 16, it was predicated on this idea that I would somehow get better. And that wasn't always the case. I remember getting in trouble in grade 12 when I decided to decline a surgery that I had already done, because I wanted to be the first person in my family to go off to university, to graduate on time with the rest of my class. And I said, "I already did the surgery. If it didn't work, it didn't work. Why do I have to do it again?" And the surgeon looked at my mom like she was absurd for supporting me in my right to say no. And she told me she felt like her intelligence and her parenthood was being questioned by the doctors, because at 17, how do I know what's right for me and what's best for me? A lot of these experiences happened again, not just in the medical system, but the education system, what I learned about our prison systems over and over and over again, where people are policed or told how to function because of the fact that they are labeled or live with a disability. I think back to grade 9 when I was so excited to be given a spare in place of gym, because the school I was at the time didn't have proper supports to support me in physical education. But what that meant in the long run was that I was also missing critical education around sexual health that the rest of my peers received. And I know now that women with disabilities are 3 times more likely to experience sexual violence, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and to not learn about their sexual health and their rights up until their mid to late 20s. Gee, I wonder why that is. I wonder how, over and over again, being told what is best for me or what is right for me by these systems that exist is hurting myself and people with disabilities in the long run. Kind of the last straw for me in all of this was in grade 12 when I was told that I should attend college instead of university. Because university might be too difficult or wouldn't have as much supports, or I could take it easier in college. Obviously, I didn't listen to them. I got accepted to McMaster University and I graduated a year ago. But at the time, I started to learn more about the ways in which these systems were interconnecting to tell me and people like me what my rights were and how I should proceed to exist as a person with a disability. I learned about the Aurelia Asylum of Idiots and how, similar to the residential school process, people with disabilities were identified and institutionalized, oftentimes without their consent, and forced to live in the institutions like these for years and be subjected to sexual violence, physical violence, to the extent where there is a grave outside of that hospital where people are fighting for it not to be developed over, because there were children there and people there buried with no names who were clients at this hospital. I think of the Ross A. McDonald School of the Blind, where it was a boarding school where people with disabilities, people with visual impairments specifically, were forced to drink their own pee out of urinals, were subjected to sexual assault, sexual violence, and physical violence as well. Again, we're seeing these institutions tell us, similar to Indigenous residential schools, that people with disabilities should be othered, should be separated from the rest of society because we're different. And this is not an accident. I think of the link between colonialism and ableism that often gets dismissed. The fact that when slaves were escaping their masters, they were labeled as being mentally incompetent, as needing medical support, medical care, in order to keep them back in the reins and away from freedom. Or you look at more recent times in the 60s, where people were fighting for their civic rights during the Black liberation movements, and a lot of Black activists were labeled as having schizophrenia, Black men specifically, in order to stop their protests. You could take it way back to when we started to define colonialism and slavery and talk about the language behind it, where Black people were labeled as incompetent, inferior, and the link between ableism and colonialism there. You can also take a look at the Alberta Sterilization Act, the ways in which people with disabilities were sterilized against their will, knowledge, or consent, and Indigenous women were sterilized under that act without their will, knowledge, or consent as well. And a lot of this information is not openly easy to find. It's not something that I learned in school. I didn't learn that I was part of a community or a history or a movement, right? You're taught to internalize these experiences, which teaches you that you are a burden on society and teaches you to take an individual approach to all of these systemic issues that are interconnected. I don't think it's a mistake that the same barriers I was facing in the medical systems were replicated in the education systems and are replicated in our prison systems or our policing systems. The fact that we talk about police brutality and Black Lives Matter, and also the fact that Abdirahman Abdi, who was killed in Ottawa, had autism and was a Black man. Or Jermaine Carby or Andrew Loku both had diagnosed mental illnesses or schizophrenia. They weren't just Black men. The link is there between the ways in which we're using these institutions to police who has the right to live and who does not. And I could turn on my TV and see a lot of conversation around assisted suicide and the right to death. And then drive down to the GO station terminal and record a video for half an hour of 4 transit constables getting on top of a man who is living in poverty, clearly, who they identify has a mental illness, and and watch them arrest him for something that he didn't do. He was just sitting there. He just was existing in this space. I think there are a lot of different ways that our medical system and the way that it has been created today is harmful, specifically on a policy level as well. We hear a lot about talking about accessibility. And that rhetoric, the way it's being implemented into policy, is such that we talk about the economic benefits of people with disabilities in our society. Or we talk about my ability to execute purchasing power in a store being justice. But that leaves out people with disabilities who don't fit the mold of being productive, who can't execute that purchasing power. Do they have the right to exist? Do they have the right to access? I would argue not under that framework of economic benefit. I would argue that this rhetoric of making sure that we talk about accessibility instead of disability justice, instead of looking at the flaws in our prison systems and the way that we still use seclusionary tactics on people who are diagnosed as needing supports from our medical systems, the ways in which Solomon Fakiri, a Muslim man with schizophrenia, was taken to a prison cell and put in solitary confinement and then killed instead of taken to a hospital where he was waiting for a bed. I think talking about the economic benefit to accessibility and my right to expend purchasing power leaves out a lot of people in the conversation around disability justice and what it means to live in a society that is equal for everybody, that is just. We talk a lot about this idea of independence, especially in the medical system or the medical model. The idea that as soon as someone's born, you should be trying to teach them the skills through ABA or other forms of therapy to fit into this box of what it means to be independent and have the right to live. And even before that point, it's a battle to even be born. I question the fact that there is more funding going into the prenatal screening of Down syndrome than there is toward the life of a child with Down syndrome. I'm pro-choice, but I also question the fact that there's this institutional medical structure which is documented to be pushing nurses and doctors to strongly suggest that people terminate pregnancies if their pregnancy is identified as having a child with a disability. What does that mean when we have these institutional forces dictating who has the right to live? My mother was bedridden from her first term with me, and the doctors also strongly suggested that I be terminated. They told her I wouldn't walk, talk, eat on my own. As a woman in poverty, she wouldn't be able to handle it. And she said no. I question a system that's now putting a lot of resources toward childhood disability, but then quietly cutting supports of adults with disabilities. It's as though when we turn 17, a lot of services are axed. And a lot of you know this as people in the medical profession, how you're not even taught about developmental disabilities in adulthood. I am terrified to go to a doctor because I know that if I need support, oftentimes I won't find someone who understands my disability and what it means to grow with it. I understand that when I get hit by a car driving down the street, and I go to a doctor and I tell them that I'm in pain or when the police come on scene, or the paramedics come on scene, all three people from all those three systems, the first question they'll ask me is your pain before the accident? Was it from before the accident or after? And then they'll dismiss me without any supports or meds because they don't understand that I understand what I need. I can differentiate between disability-related pain and struggles and what I need. A couple months ago, I talked to a really good friend of mine who I now consider a mentor, Ingwang Ward, about this concept of parenthood as someone with a disability. Because it's not something that I conceptualized until I met her. And she told me honestly, because I asked for an honest answer. She was like, you shouldn't really consider something like that unless you have the financial resources for lawyers, because you're going to be early documented and bothered about your right to parenthood in terms of the legal system, in terms of children's aid. And you're going to be heavily questioned and policed. So I asked the question again. Who has the right to exist, and what does that existence look like today? We cannot just talk about people with disabilities in the box of medical care, because all of these systems are interconnected and harming people. Right? The fact that someone who is born with a developmental disability or a disability of some sort has a higher chance of developing mental illness because of isolation and all of these other systems working together to tell these people that you don't have the right to exist. Depression, anxiety, all of these issues. And I question the fact that a report came out just recently saying that people with disabilities are twice as more likely to experience a form of violence at the hand of another person. And we still don't know what the root, we act like we don't know what the root cause is. Or the fact that women with disabilities are 3 times more likely to be sexually assaulted. Or the fact that people with invisible disabilities or mental illnesses are 4 times more likely to experience violence. And this violence isn't coming from strangers. It's coming from the hands of these systems as well. So I guess I would pose the question to everybody in this room today. If we can identify that we have systems and policies that are framing people with disabilities as merely an economic benefit to society, nothing more, nothing less. If we can identify that my disability is palatable, and I'm speaking to you today in a way that you can understand, which is not much effort on your end, but there are a whole bunch of people behind me, not in this room today, who cannot communicate their needs as palatably and easily as I can. If we can identify that some of the most marginalized people in our community are Indigenous people with mental illnesses and disabilities, are people of color with disabilities, are people in our prison systems with disabilities, but they don't get seen or heard, despite the fact that we're all going to be disabled eventually because of old age. If we can identify that our education system is no good for people with moderate to severe disabilities, that funding is consistently cut from our school boards, from special education departments, that educational assistants are not getting enough training, if we can identify that from before birth, we're putting stipulations on who has the right to exist and who doesn't, if we can identify that our prison systems are identifying people with mental illnesses and our police systems are identifying and harming people with disabilities, are all these interconnected problems systemically a form of modern eugenics? I'm not going to answer the question today, but I'll leave it out there for you all to think about. This is a majority of what I wanted to say. I have 2 minutes left, but thank you for listening.